They expected starvation. They expected beatings, chaos, or at the very least, the kind of cold indifference they had seen in so many barracks across Europe. For thousands of German prisoners captured in 1944 and 1945, the phrase American captivity carried a dark, almost cinematic weight. Propaganda films had drilled one idea into their minds: surrender to the Americans, and you would never see home again. But when the gates of the first American camps opened in front of them, something remarkable happened. The fear did not disappear, not immediately, but it cracked. And through that crack came shock, confusion, and, for many, the first real meal they had tasted in weeks. This story is not a myth-busting spectacle or a nostalgic reconstruction. It is the quiet, personal experience of men who walked into the unknown and discovered that even war, brutal, unforgiving war, could produce moments of unexpected humanity. By the way, if you enjoy deep historical stories told with honesty and atmosphere, feel free to subscribe. It helps more than you think, and we will move on without interrupting the flow. For the prisoners, one of the first surprises in the American camps was the smell. Not the sour reek of unwashed clothes or damp straw that dominated many European transit camps. Not the dry metallic scent of iron beds and thin, cold soup. Instead, the air carried something warmer: cooked beans, real bread, and occasionally the unmistakable scent of meat sizzling in large field kitchens. It was not luxury. It was not meant to be comfort. But it was food that could lift the chest and make the body remember what it felt like not to shiver with hunger. American field rations had their stereotypes, even among Allied troops. Soldiers joked about the endless cans of beans or the heavy slabs of cornbread, but to men arriving from Stalag or Oflag compounds, where soup sometimes felt like colored water and bread was rationed into thin gray slices, these same American meals felt like they belonged to another world entirely. What shocked them most was not the portion size, although that alone felt unreal. It was the structure behind it. American camps had formal calorie targets, nutritional expectations, and medical protocols. These were not always met perfectly. No army runs its logistical machine at 100% efficiency. But the prisoners quickly noticed one thing. The guards ate the same food. There was no symbolic hierarchy on the plate. No gap that separated captor and captive through hunger. Some men took their first meal in silence, afraid to appear greedy. Others ate too fast and felt sick afterward. They had forgotten how normal food behaved in the stomach. One former prisoner later wrote that the bread alone nearly made him cry. It was fresh, warm, soft on the inside, not the dry, compact brick he had become used to carrying in his coat pocket back in Europe. Still, fear lingered. Many prisoners expected the kindness to be temporary, a trick, or something that would disappear once the guards grew tired of maintaining discipline. They whispered to each other at night, comparing what they had seen with what they had been told. A few believed the guards were trying to win their trust before something worse happened. A few even insisted that the food must be drugged, because why else would an enemy feed them so well? The truth was less dramatic and far more human. The United States Army had its own standards and regulations for the treatment of prisoners. These rules came from international conventions, but also from the American belief that discipline and order were inseparable. A hungry prisoner was an angry prisoner. A starving man was unpredictable. A fed man was manageable, calm, and far less likely to cause trouble. Morality and practicality intertwined in a way that gave prisoners something they had not expected: stability. Comparisons circulated constantly. Men who had come from German-run Stalag or Oflag camps carried vivid memories of their old rations. They remembered soups thickened with barley or thinned with too much water, the weekly struggle to stretch their bread ration, and the way Red Cross parcels, when they arrived, became a form of currency. In those camps, food was survival, and survival was negotiation. In the American camps, by contrast, the meals arrived because they had to. There was no bargain. Some prisoners described the American approach as almost bureaucratic kindness. It lacked the intimacy of a shared fire or a shared loaf, but it also lacked cruelty. It was a system designed to function, and because it functioned, the prisoners lived. The guards had their own opinions. Many of them had never seen a German soldier up close before. They were surprised by how young some of the prisoners were, surprised by the fear in their eyes, and surprised by how quickly food softened the atmosphere. A bowl of chili or a plate of hash and canned peaches did more to calm tension than any shouted order. There were, of course, exceptions. Not every camp was equal. Some were overcrowded. Some were understaffed. Some commanders were stricter than others. But in the broad sweep of prisoner testimonies, one theme stands above the rest. The food in the American camps was better, often dramatically better than anything they had expected. And as days turned into weeks, something else changed. The meals began to feel less like a miracle and more like a routine. The prisoners adjusted. They learned the rhythm of the kitchen. They recognized the clatter of tin trays before each mealtime. They noted the days when meat would appear, and the days when it would not. Some men even developed preferences, secretly hoping for certain combinations. In those early weeks, food became more than nourishment. It became a message. You are here. You are alive, and no one is going to let you starve. What the prisoners did not yet know was how profoundly this predictable rhythm of eating 3 meals a day, every day, would shape their memory of American captivity. For many, it marked the first time the war stopped feeling like an endless grind and started feeling like something they might survive. For many prisoners, the second shock after entering an American camp was not the food itself, but the rhythm around it. In Europe, especially in the final months of the war, the idea of a meal schedule had almost vanished. Retreat, bombardments, collapsing logistics, and the sheer chaos of the front had turned eating into something random. A crust of bread here, a ladle of weak soup there. Sometimes nothing. In the American camps, mealtimes were marked by sound, metal trays stacking, boots on gravel, the deep mechanical rattle of a field kitchen being prepared. To the prisoners, these sounds became signals of safety. You could be tired, confused, or half frozen, but you knew that at certain hours food would appear. Not a rumor, not a promise. Actual food. The prisoners often described the first full breakfast they were given. It varied by camp, but several common elements stood out. A cup of hot coffee, strong and bitter. Some men had not tasted real coffee in years. Thick slices of bread. Jam or butter, sometimes both. Eggs, scrambled in huge metal pans. On lucky days, canned sausages or fried potatoes. These were not extravagant meals, but to men who had lived on starvation rations in the later stages of the war, The sheer presence of fat, protein, and heat made their bodies react almost violently. Soldiers who once could devour entire portions of field ration bread now found themselves full halfway through a plate. Others felt a strange heaviness in the stomach, a reminder that their digestive systems had spent too long operating on the edge of collapse. One former prisoner later wrote that the first breakfast felt like waking up from a long winter. Another said that he realized, as he tasted the eggs, that he had forgotten the sound of his own stomach when it was satisfied. But with food came memories, and with memories came comparisons, especially to German-run Stalag and Oflag camps. Not every German camp was the same. Some officers' camps were better supplied than enlisted camps, but certain patterns repeated often enough to become universal experiences. Prisoners in Stalag compounds often described their bread as gray brick, dense and rationed with mathematical precision. Their soup, frequently called Erbsensuppe, was a thin mixture of peas or barley, depending on availability. Meat appeared rarely and in small portions. Many men relied on Red Cross parcels to fill the gaps, and when these parcels were delayed or intercepted, hunger became a daily battle. By contrast, American captors treated food distribution not as a negotiation, but as a logistical obligation. The prisoners noticed that even on days when the guards were frustrated or the weather was miserable, the kitchen line still operated. Even on days when transport was delayed, the meals found a way to reach the camp. And although portions could vary, the baseline remained surprisingly high. This difference between a system driven by scarcity and a system driven by procedure became one of the defining impressions of American captivity. Many prisoners later admitted that they had never expected food to be the thing that restored their sense of humanity. They had assumed discipline or medical care might do that. But no, food reached deeper. It also sparked quiet conversations at night. Men whispered about the contrast between propaganda and reality. They had been told that Americans were cruel, decadent, and indifferent to suffering. They had been warned that surrendering to the Western Allies meant certain torment. Yet here they were, sitting on wooden benches, eating hot meals that tasted like something their mothers might have cooked in better years. Some prisoners resisted these emotions. They did not want to feel gratitude. Gratitude felt like weakness, or even betrayal. So they focused on the practical side of things. They told themselves that Americans fed them well only because it was required, or because it made management easier, and there was truth in that. But over time, even the most stubborn among them could not completely ignore the smell of fresh bread or the comfort of warm coffee on a cold morning. There were also cultural surprises. For prisoners raised on German or Austrian cuisine, certain American foods felt foreign or strange. Cornbread was one example. Some men loved it immediately. Others compared its texture to sweet sand. Canned chili baffled them. Peanut butter caused confusion and debate. A few prisoners initially refused to touch it because they thought it was some kind of medicinal paste. But after a few days, even peanut butter found its fans. Canned fruit, especially peaches and pears, left a stronger impact. These were rare luxuries in wartime Europe. The syrupy sweetness felt almost unreal, like something from a childhood memory. Several former prisoners wrote that canned peaches were the single most comforting food they tasted during captivity. Not because they were delicious, though they were, but because they symbolized abundance. something they had not seen in years. The guards, watching the reactions, often softened as well. Human beings, even in uniform, respond to the sight of hunger easing. A few guards began exchanging jokes with the prisoners while distributing meals. Others sat nearby during lunch breaks, eating their own food, creating a strange image of normalcy. Captor and captive separated by a fence, but connected by the universal routine of eating. This was not friendship. It was not reconciliation. It was simply the quiet erosion of fear. However, not everything was ideal. There were camps where overcrowding strained the system. There were days when the cooks were overwhelmed, when food arrived late or cold, when trays ran out, or when rations had to be stretched. Some prisoners complained about repetitive menus, or the lack of fresh vegetables. These frustrations were real, but even then, the baseline of nutrition remained higher than what many prisoners had known for years. There were also stories from camps where hostility rose, where certain guards resented feeding enemy soldiers so well, especially after hearing news from the front. But the system usually overpowered individual tempers. The rules said the prisoners must be fed, and so they were fed. The most fascinating testimonies describe a shift that happened slowly, sometimes without the prisoners noticing it. After weeks of reliable meals, the men began regaining weight. Their skin tone improved. Their posture straightened. Their minds grew sharper. They argued more, laughed more, and even sang at night. One prisoner wrote that he did not recognize the man he had become during captivity. "I remembered that I was human," he said. "I had forgotten that before." Beyond the fence, the war raged on. But inside the camps, food became a strange oasis, a pause in the brutality of the world. Many prisoners later credited those meals with keeping them alive, not just physically, but emotionally. The quiet consistency of breakfast, lunch, and dinner restored structure to lives shattered by chaos. The Americans did not feed their prisoners out of sentimentality. They fed them because it was the rule, because it reduced problems, and because it upheld the image they wanted the world to see. But regardless of motives, the impact on the prisoners was profound. They had expected a cage. What they found instead was a system that, through something as simple as food, told them that the war could end, and when it did, they might still have a life waiting for them on the other side. As weeks turned into months, the food in the American camps stopped being a source of shock, and instead became a quiet foundation of daily life. The prisoners still talked about it, but now their conversations shifted from disbelief to routine concerns. They debated which kitchen crews cooked better, which meals were the most filling, and which days of the week seemed to bring the best portions. In a strange way, these debates resembled the old conversations they used to have in their barracks back home, long before the war had consumed everything. The camp kitchens themselves became points of fascination. In many German-run camps, kitchens were small, strained, and often forced to rely on local foraging or inconsistent supplies. By contrast, the American field kitchens were loud, efficient, and almost industrial in their organization. The prisoners marveled at the size of the pots and pans, at the mechanical precision of the food distribution, and at the fact that everything seemed standardized. To them, it felt like watching a machine that always moved, regardless of weather, morale, or external chaos. Rumors spread about the origins of the food. Some prisoners believed the Americans received endless supplies from stateside farms, imagining vast fields of wheat and corn feeding the war machine. Others thought the meals were leftovers from troops stationed nearby. A few insisted, half joking and half serious, that the Americans must be rich beyond comprehension if they could feed their prisoners so well while fighting a global war. In truth, much of the food came from massive logistical networks built to support millions of soldiers spread across continents. For the United States Army, consistency was a weapon just as important as tanks or aircraft. A well-fed soldier fought better, and by extension, a well-fed prisoner was easier to manage. This practicality, combined with adherence to international conventions, created an environment where even enemy combatants received meals that many civilians in wartime Europe could only dream of. Yet the prisoners' reactions to the food were not purely physical. Food tapped into something deeper, something almost spiritual after years of deprivation. Certain smells, especially the scent of warm bread or meat stew, awakened memories long buried under layers of exhaustion. Men who had forgotten their pre-war lives suddenly remembered family meals, festive holidays, or quiet evenings when a warm plate on a table symbolized safety and belonging. Some prisoners confessed that their first real emotional breakdowns in captivity came not from fear or despair, but from the shock of tasting something familiar. A spoonful of potato soup reminded one man of his grandmother's kitchen. A slice of buttered bread brought another man back to the early mornings of his youth, walking to school with a lunch satchel. Food, in these moments, did what words could not. It reconnected them to who they had been before uniforms, orders, and destruction reshaped their world. There were cultural misunderstandings, too. German soldiers had strong culinary traditions, and some were skeptical of American dishes that felt too sweet, too spicy, or too heavily canned. But the longer they stayed, the more open they became. Some even began asking for extra servings of foods they initially disliked. A few entered the American-style kitchen crews assigned from within the camp, helping peel potatoes or wash dishes. The American cooks, amused or impressed, sometimes shared stories or joked with the prisoners through gestures and simple English phrases. These interactions did not erase the reality of captivity. The fences remained. The war continued beyond the camp. Letters from home, when they arrived, were often filled with uncertainty or sorrow. Some prisoners had no idea if their families were alive. Good meals did not heal these wounds, but they gave the men strength to carry them. There were also moments of tension. In some camps, food shortages hit temporarily when supply lines were disrupted. On such days, rumors spread quickly, and old fears resurfaced. Men whispered that the Americans might cut rations permanently, or that the camp was being deprioritized. But these disruptions rarely lasted long. The kitchens returned to normal rhythm, and the underlying trust in the system slowly strengthened again. One recurring theme in prisoner recollections was the contrast between what they saw in the American camps and the narratives they had been fed by German propaganda. The propaganda had portrayed Americans as greedy, chaotic, and morally weak. It emphasized American decadence, suggesting a society obsessed with excess and unable to endure hardship. Some prisoners had believed this deeply, seeing it as a point of national pride. The Germans could endure hunger, cold, and scarcity with stoic discipline. while Americans supposedly collapsed under far lighter burdens. But the reality in the camps challenged those beliefs. The prisoners saw American efficiency, not chaos. They saw structure in the kitchens, not disorder. They saw guards eating the same food as the prisoners, creating a sense of fairness that astonished many of them. And they saw that the Americans' abundance was not weakness, but an expression of industrial strength. This realization did not always come easily. Some men clung to old ideas, refusing to let go of beliefs that had shaped them for years. Others quietly adjusted their worldview, understanding that if their enemy had the resources to feed even prisoners well, then perhaps the stories they had heard were incomplete or distorted. Another surprising element was the role of Red Cross inspections. In German-run camps, Red Cross parcels were both a blessing and a complicated source of conflict. They filled nutritional gaps, but also introduced inequality among prisoners depending on rank, connections, and distribution systems. In American camps, Red Cross involvement often served as an additional layer of oversight. The prisoners noticed this and interpreted it as further proof that the Americans were committed to maintaining certain standards. Whether this was out of genuine moral principle or international pressure mattered little. What mattered was that the meals continued reliably. Nighttime in the camps often revolved around discussing food memories. The prisoners spoke of dishes from home, of childhood flavors, of regional specialties. These conversations became a form of emotional survival. One man described it as a kind of therapy. Another compared it to a ritual that helped them remember that life existed beyond the camp, beyond the war, beyond the identity of prisoner. Food even influenced discipline. Well-fed prisoners were less likely to resist or become violent. Every guard knew this, and while some guards viewed the prisoners simply as part of their job, others grew unexpectedly protective of them. A few camp commanders developed reputations for being strict but fair, ensuring that the kitchens ran properly and that rations were distributed evenly. Prisoners remembered these men with respect long after the war ended. Of course, there were darker stories, moments when food was delayed or mishandled, when tensions flared, or when prisoners were punished and temporarily denied privileges. But these stories were far less common than the ones describing order, consistency, and the surprising sense of stability that meals created. As spring arrived, many prisoners began regaining their physical strength. Their cheeks filled out. Their eyes brightened. They stood straighter in roll call. American doctors noted the changes, confirming that steady nutrition was reversing months or even years of slow starvation. Some prisoners wrote diaries, describing their changing bodies with a mix of pride and disbelief. One man wrote, "I feel like a plant that has been watered after dying." Another wrote that he had forgotten what it felt like not to feel empty inside. They did not just regain weight. They regained the ability to think clearly, to hope, and to imagine a future. This was the quiet transformation that food brought. Not dramatic, not heroic, but deeply human. The men had entered captivity expecting humiliation, suffering, and hunger. Instead, they found that their captors fed them well enough to restore their strength, and, in doing so, restored parts of their identity they thought they had lost forever. As the seasons shifted, the daily rhythm of meals in the American camps became more than a routine. It became a kind of internal clock, a quiet reassurance that time was moving forward, even when the prisoners themselves felt suspended between past and future. For many of them, food became the most reliable marker of stability, something that separated captivity under the Americans from the uncertainty they had known elsewhere in Europe. By late spring and early summer, the improved physical condition of the prisoners was impossible to ignore. Men who had arrived thin, hollow-eyed, and weak were now standing straighter, walking with more energy, and showing a kind of cautious optimism that had seemed unthinkable during the final months of the war. One American medic described it as watching people come back from a long blackout. Clean linens, regular showers, and stable lodging certainly helped, but every testimony returns to the same central point. It was the food that changed everything first. With growing strength came sharper minds, and with sharper minds came more complex feelings. The prisoners were still soldiers, still the defeated side of a brutal conflict. But a strange emotional shift was happening. The more they interacted with the American system, especially through meal distribution, the harder it became to maintain older beliefs about absolute differences between nations, ideologies, or cultures. Many prisoners later wrote that the first time they saw American guards laughing together over lunch or sharing cigarettes near the kitchen area, they realized something important. The Americans were not the monstrous figures that propaganda had described. They were simply men, most of them young, many of them far from home, carrying out orders in a war they often did not fully understand, and that recognition made the daily act of eating feel less like a transaction and more like a tenuous bridge between enemies. Prisoners began to observe American eating habits with curiosity. Some were surprised by how casually the guards combined sweet and savory foods. Others marveled at the amount of coffee Americans consumed. Bread seemed less central to American meals, replaced with potatoes, cornmeal, or canned goods. The prisoners learned to predict, almost intuitively, what the next meal would be just by watching the supply trucks roll into the camp. They became experts in reading the signs. If the boxes were labeled with numbers ending in certain codes, it meant canned meat. If they saw large sacks of flour, it meant biscuits or cornbread. If fruit crates appeared, spirits in the camp rose instantly. Some prisoners kept informal calendars, tracking when certain dishes appeared. It became a small tradition to look forward to specific foods, a way to break the monotony. Even the simplest meals took on meaning because they represented more than sustenance. They also represented predictability, something that had vanished long ago. But while the food was consistent, emotions were not. As the war neared its end in Europe, rumors spread quickly among the prisoners. Some said Germany had surrendered. Others insisted the war would continue, and that their fate would remain uncertain. Meal lines became centers of whispered speculation. A man might take a bowl of stew from the kitchen window and immediately lean toward the nearest companion, asking, "Have you heard anything new?" The food tasted the same, but every bite carried the weight of fear, hope, or confusion. The American guards, too, sensed the tension. Some tried to calm the prisoners by being more patient or offering small gestures of kindness. Others avoided conversation entirely, not wanting to give false hope. But the one constant was the kitchen. The food never stopped. Even on the day when official news of the German surrender reached most camps, the kitchens continued on schedule. Breakfast was served, then lunch, then dinner, each meal grounding the prisoners in the reality that the worst of the war was over. When the surrender was confirmed beyond doubt, the emotions among the prisoners were overwhelming and mixed. Some cried openly. Some sat silently with their hands in their laps. Some stared at their plates, unable to eat. The food that had given them strength for months suddenly became a reminder of how much they had lost, and how much they still did not know about their families or their future. But the Americans did not change the meal routine after the surrender. If anything, the rations slightly improved in some camps. More fresh vegetables appeared, more bread, sometimes even fresh meat rather than canned. The prisoners noticed this and interpreted it in different ways. Some saw it as a gesture of mercy. Others believed it was simply the natural result of a war winding down and supply lines stabilizing. But whatever the reason, the outcome was the same. The men continued to grow stronger. It was during these post-surrender weeks that the most detailed prisoner accounts were written. With the pressure of war lifted, camp life became strangely introspective. The prisoners reflected more deeply on what they had experienced. Many of them compared American food not only to what they had eaten in German camps, but also to what they had eaten as soldiers on the front. Frontline rations had been unpredictable, sometimes plentiful, sometimes non-existent. Soldiers often lived on what they could find, barter or improvise. Bread grew stale, canned goods were rationed, and warm meals became rare luxuries. When prisoners contrasted this with the structured meals in captivity, they experienced a strange sense of irony. They often ate more consistently as prisoners than they had as active soldiers. This realization led to uncomfortable conversations. Some men wondered why their own army had failed to provide similar consistency, despite boasting of discipline, order, and national strength. Others reminded them that the collapsing front and Allied advances had cut supply lines to the bone. Still, the contrast gnawed at them. One prisoner wrote in his diary, "It is strange to feel your body healing in the hands of the enemy." Another wrote, "We prepared ourselves for punishment, but what we received was a reminder of how a system can care for even those it does not love." These thoughts did not erase their loyalty or their sense of identity, but they marked the beginning of a subtle transformation. Food also played a role in shaping the prisoners' expectations about repatriation. Rumors circulated that those who were healthier would be sent home sooner. Whether true or not, it motivated many men to eat every meal, even dishes they disliked. The camp doctors encouraged this mindset, emphasizing that restoring full health would make travel easier when the time came. For some prisoners, regaining strength led to unexpected responsibilities. They were assigned small jobs in the camp, cleaning areas, maintaining order, or assisting with meal distribution. These tasks gave structure to their days, and for the first time since captivity began, made them feel less like passive objects of war. Helping carry food crates or organizing serving lines made them feel human again, even useful. In this period, the most striking testimonies describe the emotional contrast between the men's internal turmoil and the comforting simplicity of the meals. They were haunted by uncertainty, yet grounded by food. They felt the weight of defeat, yet the rhythm of the kitchen reminded them that survival was still possible. They mourned the past, but the warmth of the soup, the softness of the bread, or the sweetness of canned fruit reminded them that life continued. By midsummer, many prisoners began thinking about the future. What would their homes look like? Would their families accept them? Would they find jobs? Would they carry shame or relief? The Americans, sensing these questions, sometimes offered small words of encouragement as they handed out meals. Nothing elaborate, just a few simple phrases like, "You will go home soon," or "Things will be better." And even if the prisoners did not fully believe these words, they appreciated them. The emotional complexity of this period cannot be overstated. The prisoners were still captives, still uncertain, still recovering. But the food in the American camps had quietly reshaped their lives, giving them physical strength and emotional resilience at a moment when both were desperately needed. Food did not erase the war. It did not rewrite history. But it softened the edges of suffering, restored dignity where it had been lost, and provided a foundation from which thousands of men could finally imagine a world beyond fences and guard towers. As the months passed, and repatriation finally became a reality rather than a rumor, the prisoners' relationship with food in the American camps took on a new meaning. The meals that once shocked them with their abundance and warmth now symbolized a transitional period between survival and a future they were only beginning to imagine. The kitchens, once a place of fear and disbelief, became a space that anchored them to a sense of order, while the rest of their lives drifted in uncertainty. By late 1945, many prisoners had fully regained their physical strength. Doctors noted increases in weight, improvements in posture, and the disappearance of symptoms caused by prolonged malnutrition. Dizziness, shaking, fragile skin, and the constant feeling of cold even in warm weather. Some prisoners said they had not felt this healthy since before the war began. This was a bittersweet realization, because it reminded them how deeply the war had worn down their bodies long before they ever stepped into captivity. But the more their bodies healed, the more their minds wandered toward home. Every meal, whether a plate of potatoes, a bowl of chili, or a slice of soft white bread, was an unspoken reminder that soon they would eat at real tables again. Soon they would be in places where meals were prepared by family, not soldiers. Soon they would smell kitchens that belonged to their childhoods, not to an army camp in foreign soil. For many prisoners, this anticipation brought a strange mixture of joy and fear. They wanted to go home, but they did not know what home meant anymore. Cities had been bombed, farms destroyed, entire regions displaced, families scattered. Some prisoners knew their homes no longer existed on the map they carried in their memory. Others feared what news waited for them when they arrived. And yet, every day, the American camp kitchens served meals that quietly encouraged hope. Hope that the body could recover. Hope that hunger could fade. And hope that life would resume. Food was the first promise made to them in captivity, and it remained the last promise before they left. As departure dates approached, the prisoners began noticing changes in the atmosphere of the camps. Fences felt less like barriers and more like temporary lines on the ground. Roll calls became shorter, more symbolic than strict. Guards spoke more openly, some even sharing small stories or jokes. And mealtimes, once defined by rigid military discipline, softened into something closer to communal eating. Prisoners lingered longer at tables, savoring what they knew were their final weeks in captivity. In some camps, American cooks prepared farewell meals. These were nothing extravagant, but the intention behind them was unmistakable. Larger portions, a bit more meat, extra bread, sometimes canned fruit. Prisoners later recalled these final meals with surprising emotion. They remembered the warmth, the unexpected kindness, and the feeling that, after everything they had endured, someone wanted them to leave with dignity. One prisoner described his final dinner in captivity as the first time I allowed myself to believe that I might live a normal life again. Another wrote that the taste of warm potatoes jolted him back to memories of sitting at his parents' kitchen table as a child. These moments mattered not because the food was extraordinary, but because it represented safety at a time when their lives had been defined by danger. As the prisoners prepared to depart, many of them packed small notebooks or diaries they had written during captivity. These journals often contained detailed descriptions of meals, lists, observations, comparisons. Some men saved ration labels or scraps of packaging to show their families, as if to prove that the rumors they would later repeat were not exaggerations. They had eaten well in captivity, sometimes better than during their last years as soldiers. On the day of departure, the American guards called the men to line up outside the kitchens. They received one last meal before transport. The smell of warm bread and coffee drifted across the yard. Some men joked nervously. Others stood in silence. A few wiped their eyes when no one was looking. Food had become part of their identity as prisoners. It had been their comfort, their structure, their connection to normal life. To leave the camp was to leave behind this unexpected stability, but it was also the beginning of the next chapter. One filled with uncertainties they were finally strong enough to face. Many prisoners later admitted that their memories of American captivity were deeply shaped by the meals they received. They remembered the fear they arrived with, the weakness in their limbs, and the uncertainty in their hearts. But they also remembered the warmth of soup on cold mornings, the softness of bread after months of scarcity, the simple comfort of a full stomach, and the dignity of being fed regularly even by an enemy. These experiences complicated their understanding of the war. They did not forget the destruction, the loss, or the ideologies that had led to the conflict. But they came to understand that within the machinery of war, small acts of consistency, like a well-cooked meal, could restore a sense of humanity where it had nearly disappeared. When they finally returned home, many prisoners struggled to put their experiences into words. Families asked them about life in captivity, expecting tales of brutality, starvation, or violence. And while some prisoners had indeed faced hardships in earlier stages of the war, their time in American camps often contradicted the darker assumptions. So they hesitated. Some described the food only briefly, not wanting to seem grateful to the enemy. Others spoke openly, telling their families that the meals had kept them alive, physically and emotionally. A few avoided the topic entirely, believing that telling the truth might sound like betrayal or weakness. But decades later, in memoirs, interviews, and written recollections, a consistent picture emerged. The food in American camps had not been luxurious, but it had been real, warm, and predictable. It had been enough to reverse starvation, enough to rebuild strength, enough to restore dignity. And in a world torn apart by conflict, these simple qualities elevated ordinary meals into something extraordinary. For many former prisoners, certain foods would forever carry a powerful emotional charge. The smell of fresh bread could bring them instantly back to the moment when they first realized they would not starve. The taste of canned peaches could remind them of the first time they felt hope in captivity. Even coffee, which some had disliked before the war, became a symbol of survival. As the years passed, these memories softened, but never disappeared. They became part of a larger story, a story of fear giving way to resilience, of propaganda giving way to lived experience, and of basic human needs being met in a place where humanity had nearly been swallowed by war. This is the quiet truth behind the myths of American captivity. The food was not perfect. The camps were not perfect. But within the imperfect machinery of war, the meals given to prisoners created moments of comfort and stability that shaped thousands of lives. And perhaps that is why so many former prisoners, when asked decades later what they remembered most clearly from their time in American hands, did not speak of discipline, fences, or boredom, but of bread, coffee, warm stew, and the unexpected kindness hidden in something as simple as a daily meal. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more historical narratives told with honesty and atmosphere, feel free to subscribe. It truly helps, and I appreciate it more than you know.